to go. All right. In this lab, we're going to be breaking down the teach pendant operations. We'll review a few of the safety features that are tied into the robot system, especially through the teach pendant. But just a quick recap, our robot CERT cart system is broken down into three main components. The first one and the most obvious one is the articulated robot, so that robot arm. The second is going to be the controller, which is underneath the cart. That is really the brain of our robot system. And then the third component, focusing on in this lab, is going to be the teach pendant. The teach pendant is really just how we as programmers and technicians and engineers interact with the robot. All of the hard work is going on inside the controller. The teach pendant, as well as using the RoboGuide simulation software, is how we actually run through programs and make the robot move. So in order to start using the teach pendant, we need to make sure that we are in teach mode. So right now, our robot is in full auto. I can tell that because our key is turned to auto, our light is on green. If I step forward, you're going to see it go to red because I'm in that area scanner zone. When we turn it off from full auto into teach mode, you essentially make it so we can get up and close and personal with the robot. We're bypassing that area scanner, so that's safety. And because of the safety features built into the teach pendant, we can safely be in close proximity to the robot. The other thing that we need to do in order to work with the teach pendant is we need to turn our teach pendant on. Now, if you notice, it was never really off. The teach pendant really it's on. It means that we're able to actually start jogging and moving around the robot. Now, you noticed right when I turn the teach pendant on, I immediately have a fault in place, and that comes up as the dead man switch has been released. In order to move the robot, we need to press in that dead man switch. So if I flip this over, if you remember, there's two positions, 1, 2. That first position is how we are able to clear the fault and start jogging. You can do it on either side. If you're left-handed or right-handed, you don't need to do both. Remember that if you are in the one position and you squeeze in, that's also going to trigger that fault. So as an example, I hold into the one position, I press reset, my fault goes away. If I hold down shift, I can start jogging the robot. If I squeeze into that second position, you can see that fault comes back in. I need to hit reset and let go. All right, we will be jogging the robot shortly, but first let's break down the teach pendant a little bit more. With these new R30IB Plus controllers, there's almost technically four different ways that you can navigate this teach pendant. For example, the first way is that this is a touch screen. So when we did basic setup in RoboGuide, you'll see the same icons come up here. That is important to do. You will have to interact with the touch screen. The other way to work or navigate menus is if I press menu, I can scroll to find all of the different functions within my menus. I can use the number system. So if I wanted to focus on I/O, I can hit 5. If I go back to menu, I can also do touchscreen and then navigate that way. My recommendation to you is to practice and teach one method of navigating this menu. And my number one recommendation for this is to actually use the cursor keys. It's very easy to go into a menu that you weren't intentionally trying to get into, or can get lost pretty easily. But if you are using the cursor functions, you are able to see if I want to go to setup and I'm going to set up specific frames, I can hit enter and I know exactly where I'm going to go. So you will need to use the touchscreen function throughout, but I definitely recommend as you're navigating menus, definitely use the cursor buttons down here. Let's start from the top to the bottom and kind of break down the teach pendant a little bit. What you'll see at the top are status indicators. You'll also see things like busy, run, step, hold. Right now we currently have a fault in place. These are going to turn green or pop up yellow or red whenever a different status indicator comes into place. So for example, if I press the step button, step mode is going to be in place. All step mode is we can actually cycle through a program line by line, and it'll stop at each line. So that's what step mode is. If you're unable to run the robot, yeah, it might be in step mode. You can turn that on. Again, if I turn on my unmanned switch and hit reset, you'll see that fault indicator move away. And then also if I go to a program and actually switch it to run a program either in teach mode or in full auto, you'll see run come into play, you'll see busy. Those are probably the main ones that you'll focus on or run into. Moving across, you'll see these are notifications here whenever you get a fault or a notification that your program's locked by another task. That will pop up right here. You'll also see things like joint, which calls out the different coordinate systems that we're in. We'll spend some more time on that later. And then you're also going to see a percentage at the top. The percentage is how fast the robot is, its percentage and speed. In teach mode, remember, because of dual check safety system, we are limiting the speed in our robot, but you can adjust that speed down here at the bottom. See these two plus and minus percentage points. I can go up by 5, or if I hold down shift, I can jump up by 50 or 100%. Again, in teach mode, you won't be moving the robot at 100% or even 50%. It really cuts it back so you can actually teach and program points. Scrolling down a little bit, I'm going to move beyond this main screen and just start looking at some of the different button options. The first one I'll press is menu. This is where we see a lot of setting up different I/O, different functions that's related to frames, user frames, file manipulation. This is really where we're getting into some of the more background work within the robot and the teach pendant. I can always hit previous to X out to get back out of that. Moving just to the right here, these 3 buttons are all related to how we teach programs. So if I hit select, that pulls up all of the programs that are currently loaded into this robot. Again, you can scroll up and down. You can also hold down shift and then be able to page up. And you're going to see a lot of additional auxiliary programs for demos, or since this robot has vision incorporated into it, you're going to see a lot of programs related to that. If you go towards the top, you'll see things like a battery demo or a CERT demo that exercises all the joints. Anytime you see a program, you have these options here at the bottom where we can copy the program, we can provide more details, we can load it up, we can save as. We can even print a copy of that program for records and for planning purposes. And then at any time you see this little caret here, we can move and see things like create a new program. We can delete, monitor, we can make copies. All of these touch screen buttons are also replicated by the F1 through F5. So if I want to create a program, I can use the touch screen, put in the program name, or I can also hit F2, and it'll bring me to the same point. When I look at, say, if we pull up our CERT demo, I can press enter, and I can see the program be pulled up. I can scroll down through it. We can page down. Just another way to navigate. So I'm going to go back to select and actually touch on, let's go to edit, same thing, it'll pull up that program. And then data is where we get into registers, so like position registers and data registers. If you click type, you'll see all the different types. We won't be touching on this, and we'll mention it in this lab progression, but just want to show that these 3 buttons are all related to teaching and programming with the robot. I'm going to back down, go a little bit further. You'll see you have 2 shift buttons on either side, so right hand or left hand. You can utilize the either side of the teach pendant. Going down a little bit further, we have our cursor buttons. I showed you step before. What I also want to point out, and what you've obviously noticed on the teach pendant, there isn't a joystick. Everything is run by different axes or joints. And you're going to see that the joints that we called out before in the robot system, joints 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that's our 6-axis robot. You'll also notice there's a 7 and 8 if you have a robot system that's on a gantry that moves in an X-Y axis, or a rail gantry, or an additional axis that moves the robot up and down, the whole robot system. Tend to see these be utilized more in industry. So these are individual joints being broken down. You also see XYZ, and then XYZ again, also known as yaw, pitch, and roll. Scrolling down a little bit further, you'll see our reset button. This is something that we'll need to touch on often. Backspace can be used within different typing of programs. Enter is something that you'll use often to select a program. And then you'll also see something like forward and backward. So we can actually pull up a program, and what I'm going to do is scroll down to find an example. Just going to do a simple toggle gripper, which is a program that we put in place. I can actually cycle through this program. If I hold down the teach pendant, hold shift, hit reset, I can cycle through this program and actually have it run on its own. So here, this is opening and closing our gripper. You can see that. I can also put it in step mode and step through each individual line as it were to come through. So that's where the forward and backward, the step mode and forward and backward is a really nice feature if you're testing out a program and you want to see exactly where the robot's going to go before you run it in full auto or run it all the way through. So I'll turn step off. You're also going to see a button right below forward backward. That's the coordinate button. We're going to spend a lot of time in the next lab talking about the different coordinate systems. But what this does, if you noticed at the top, we are currently in joint mode. The coordinate button changes the coordinate system. So that's jog frame. This is world or linear or Cartesian. Then we also have tool frame and user frame. So I'm going to keep it in joint mode right now. One thing to note that is if you press shift and I press shift coordinate, you can see it pulls up what tool frame, jog frame, and user frame that we are in. When we get into frames, this will make a little bit more sense, but long story short, you can have multiple user frames. You can have multiple tool frames for different end-of-arm tools. So if you scroll down and choose one of these, I could put in 2, I could put in any number of different tool frames that we have. I'm going to keep it at 1 right now. So again, coordinate changes the coordinate system. And then if I hold down shift coordinate, that'll actually change it to a different tool frame. All right. So moving down a little bit further, you'll see items here like tool 1 and tool 2. These are macro function buttons where we can actually assign a tool program to each of these buttons. And it actually moves down. There's 7 different options. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we can actually assign macro keys, shift user macro keys to these. The ones that we currently have in place, and this is a program that your instructor can share with you. Tool 1 opens and closes the gripper, as you can see in the program. And then if I go to toggle suction, I assigned shift user key to tool 2, where I can turn on the pneumatic suction cup that is attached to this end-of-arm tool. So when we work with welding robots or paint robots, sometimes the tool 1 and tool 2 will be, plus wire, minus wire, purge gas. These are typically related to the function of that robot. Moving down a little bit further, some pretty important buttons down here. We can see something like I/O, which pulls up all of our inputs and outputs. So here I've got robot inputs and outputs, and I can actually go and find all of those gripper functions in place. I can also switch it over to digital outputs. And digital outputs pull in all of the different lights. There's a laser pointer embedded into the program. I believe that is digital output 101. So we can utilize the different lights at the top. So these are all different features that are related to inputs and outputs, and we can also add additional ones, which we'll touch on in a later lab. Looking down, another useful feature is positional data. So here, if I press just this position button, you'll see where the data is from every one of these joints. So for the most part, each of these joints are zeroed out with the exception of joint 5. You can see that at the robot. And this shows the positional data based off of each individual axis. And then, of course, this is something that you might begin to use throughout the lab or throughout the course. If any time you have a fault show up at the top and you aren't entirely certain what that is, what you can do is hit Shift, Diagnose, and it's going to pull up a menu feature where I can actually see the documentation for that alarm. I can see the cause, and then almost always it gives you a remedy to how to clear that fault. This one you already know. You pull in the dead man switch and you hit reset. So that's a useful feature that we will use for, especially when you're trying to do fault recovery, that type of thing. Last thing that I want to point out in using the teach pendant before we start moving the robot is you do have an e-stop at the top on the teach pendant. Doesn't matter if the teach pendant's on or off. This is available and able to use. You also have one on the physical controller. However, I recommend if you're trying to get the robot to stop, there's a bunch of different ways to do that rather than putting in the hard brakes on the teach pendant. So you can either lift up Shift, let go of the dead man switch, or if you're trying to cycle through a program, you can lift up on forward. A lot of different ways to do it so you're not putting too much stress on your individual joints. All right, last but not least, the function button here is a button that you will use quite often. And really, when we are working with a lot of different programs or working on setting up a macro and then going back into a program or calling different programs, sometimes the teach pendant gets locked by other programs. A really common remedy to unlock the teach pendant, unlock the robot, is hit Function, and you can see Abort All is already selected. Function, Enter. I just cleared out all of the tasks that my robot was currently doing. So it's kind of like you're doing a mini refresh, mini restart. So again, that's the function key here. You'll see there's other options, for printing screen, enabling different HMI menus. Typically, through the CERT program, this is something that gets used the most often, is Function, Enter, Abort All. So now, let's actually move our robot in joint mode. So I'm going to make sure I have joint selected at the top. I'm going to pull in my dead man switch, hit Reset, push down Shift, and I'm going to move the robot with individual joints. So each joint being moved one at a time. So here's joint 1. That's our waist. Joint 2 is going to be our shoulder. Joint 3, think of that as your elbow. Joint 4 would be rotating your forearm. And joint 5, manipulating the wrist. And then joint 6, our 6 axis, just rotates that end of arm tool. Remember to be mindful of any external pneumatic or electronic cords. Typically at this point in time, one of the best lab activities to do is to place something on the table of the CERT cart, leave it in joint mode, and then if you have these macro functions set in place where we can open and close the gripper, in joint mode, try moving the robot to go and pick up that item on the table. Remember, you need to operate each joint individually. This is one of the first labs that I often run with learners that are just trying to figure out how this robot moves and how it functions. And it also gets you pretty familiar with how each individual joint moves on the teach pendant. And before you know it, you will be memorizing exactly what each individual joint does as you move forward through the lab progression. That's the quick rundown on teach pendant operations. We introduced the concept of jogging and working with different coordinate systems. In the next lab, we will be diving into quite a bit deeper on how the robot moves in all of its different coordinate functions.